Hi, everyone. Welcome back from UK in a Changing Europe to our regular budget panel, which is your opportunity to ask people who understand these things what's going on with the economy, and particularly this time, what was going on with the budget, what it might mean, what it might do to our politics going forward with an election on the horizon. We have our usual cast of contributors: Ben Chew from the BBC, Sarah Hall from University of Cambridge and UK in a Changing Europe, Jill Rutter from UK in a Changing Europe and the IFG, and Jonathan Portes, UK in a Changing Europe, King's College London. Do please, for this one, stick your questions in the chat, because I know I'm not very good at this as a rule, but for this event in particular, what I'd like to think is, if you have any burning questions about what's going on with the economy, we can get them answered by the real experts. So just to kick us off with a softball question for the four of you in no particular order, what did you make of the budget then? Don't all rush at once. Jill.
Okay, well, talking as a former press secretary to the Treasury, from the days when we tried to preserve budget secrecy, the extent that every significant measure was pre-briefed seemed very odd to me, which you kept on assuming Jeremy Hunt must have something else. And the only thing we were really left with was this, quite niche measure. Matters if you're caught in the trap, but not to lots of other people, about the higher income child benefit charge. So it seemed a very odd tactic to me to do that. The other thing that really struck me was how far the government had moved on this income tax and national insurance debate. It seemed then to move even further towards a sort of long run ambition, aspiration, or whatever, to do away with national insurance, and pointing out the unfairness of levying two taxes on what we used to call earned income, and one tax, income tax, on unearned income, as it used to be known. But it seemed very odd, given that the Chancellor, when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, had selected national insurance as the basis for his health and social care levy. So I thought that was really quite interesting. And that's the sort of thing where it would be really interesting to have a proper debate about the relative merits of tax and whether there is actually any prospect of doing some quite interesting merger down the line. And I thought it was really interesting to ask, the extent to which that ambition was collectively shared, either within the cabinet or more generally in the Conservative Party, given we'd heard Jeremy Hunt was under loads of pressure on income tax. And I also thought it was really, really interesting that it only took a couple of days for a couple of Jeremy Hunt's colleagues to come out and say, actually, we should have been spending all that money he'd given away in national insurance cuts on defence spending, because we needed to accelerate that. So I think really shows up some of the possible flaws in the way in which we make budgets in this country.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
Just to follow up on that, I mean, I think that what Jill talks about, the sort of policy incoherence of first increasing national insurance and then cutting it and then talking about abolishing it. I mean, you can make arguments one way or the other, but you certainly can't possibly make a coherent argument for what's happened over the past few years. Similarly, the child benefit fiddle is certainly improves the situation, notably on the mess that was created by George Osborne, a mess which was predictable and predicted by virtually everybody at the time. So more broadly, I think, the budget was just dominated by the fact that it's a complete fantasy, right? I mean, as Paul Johnson said, I think yesterday, there are at least four things which aren't going to happen. We're not going to, and the budget arithmetic is entirely based on assuming that those things that aren't going to happen do in fact happen. The budget assumes that we're going to increase fuel duty. It assumes, as Jill says, we do nothing on defense. More broadly, it assumes a bunch of projections for public spending, which, if actually implemented, would lead to have already led, of course, to the point where we're letting criminals out of jail early, as the government announced at midnight last night or something, but will further lead to us not catching, convicting, or locking up criminals at all, even more than we are at the moment. So frankly, it's just a sign that this government has given up on doing anything which remotely resembles reality. I'm not sure I'd even call it scorched earth, but the real question is whether after the election, we will have a government of whatever complexion or party that tries to write a budget that is somehow at least vaguely consistent with reality.
Can you just explain child benefit fiddle for those who didn't look at the budget in as much detail as you?
Well, we used to have a universal child benefit. Everybody got it, which of course meant that it, in some sense, went to people who, quote, didn't need it. But you know, on the other hand, at least it was simple, easy to administer, and all the rest of it. In an effort to save money, George Osborne decided to scale it back by taking it away from the very richest, with a sort of cliff edge scheme where people just lost it if they went over a certain income. Over time, you know, that was bad at the time because there's no logic to it. You know, either you have a universal benefit or you just have a properly means tested benefit that goes to people who genuinely need it. Having a benefit that went 80% up the income scale was crazy. Over time, however, that because of inflation, that threshold has crept down to the point where it's affecting lots and lots more people. And also it affects dual earners and single earners differentially, again, because of the way he chose to do it. The Chancellor has smoothed out that to some extent, but he's also hugely complicated the system because he's now introduced a dual earner test into this, you know, so you will now be means tested on your child benefit on a household level, whereas we do all other aspects of taxation on an individual level. And that hasn't been implemented yet because it's actually rather complicated to implement. And so he's left that as a sort of unexploded time bomb for the next Chancellor and for HMRC, who are going to have to figure out how to do this in a way which is frankly administratively complicated and very retrograde. It goes against the major reforms made when we introduced independent taxation in the first place. And again, it's just a sign of complete policy incoherence.
Excellent, thank you. We'll come back to time bombs in a minute, but Ben, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the first thing to say is that in terms of the economic outlook, there's not really much has changed, at least as far as the OBR is concerned, since last November's autumn statement. So that's another argument against having these fiscal events so often. We should have fewer of them, one a year maximum. And in terms of the measures, I mean, I think the sort of the consensus would probably be that it was micro level pretty reasonable in some ways, macro level unreasonable, as Jonathan has articulated some of them. I mean, in some of the, on the micro side of some of the measures, the things like the non-doms tax has been reasonably well received by people who know about this area and relatively sensible reform. The child benefit thing that Jonathan's talking about, look, it improves it. It doesn't solve the problem. It slightly makes it better, but it kicks it into the long grass. But, you know, not horrendously bad. And at least it's trying to grapple with what has been a serious issue and been flagged for a long time. In terms of the tax cuts, you know, if you were going to cut a tax, it's better to cut national insurance than income tax, which was obviously being pushed for very strongly by parts of the Prime Minister and other parts of the government. So that would probably get a plus. You know, some of the public sector productivity, it's very pie in the sky, it's down the track, but they have actually put some money into NHS capital spending, which again would be seen, I think, by most experts, at least a sign of, moving in the right direction, if not fully going that way. But then obviously you have the macro unreasonableness, as Jonathan has said, of predicating all this on implausible cuts to public service spending in the next parliament. So micro reasonable, macro unreasonable, I think would be a fair judgment.
Interesting, brilliant. Sarah?
Yeah, it's always hard when you go last. I think for me, it's obviously labelled as a fiscal event, but I actually wonder if this one was more of a political event. As Jill said, I think it was quite quiet on actual announcements that we hadn't heard before, and that there was definitely no kind of rabbit out of the hat at the end of the speech. But I do think quite a lot of it looked like not exactly boxing in the opposition come a general election, but certainly trying to set out the basis upon which both parties will need to be writing their manifestos.
Wonderful. We're going to get onto that box. In fact, we get onto the boxing in now. Can I just say to people watching, because we've had a slew of questions and I'm already worried that I'm not going to get through quite a lot of them. If you can vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel, that will make life a lot easier. But we've got a question from Philip White, which I think brings us into this boxing in thing, which is which Tory tax cuts should be reversed first under a Labour government? How much of this is intended to queer the pitch for Labour by sort of denying them the revenue they need for some of the pledges they've made? I mean, is that just a far too cynical a view of this budget, do you think, or is that contain some sort of seeds of truth? Ben's too polite. He puts his hand up.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's hard to not look at the non-DOMS tax move, which was one of the few tax rises that Labour had committed to before this, and then basically doing exactly what Labour had suggested as anything other than intended to enable the Conservatives to say, well, the baseline has now shifted and you've got spending commitments which were very clearly earmarked from the proceeds of that tax. Therefore, you are going to have to put up tax by the amount to match your spending commitments because you've got the same fiscal rules as us, etc. So, look, given obviously that Jeremy Hunt had publicly said that he was not in favour of the non-dom tax for various reasons, that it would scare, you know, wealthy people away who would bring in important money to the country. So it's a big reversal for him personally. It's a big change in policy, and it's hard to see what the reason for that is, apart from being able to say Labour will have to put up taxes to pay for what they have committed to. So I don't think it's unduly cynical, no, to say that that is very politically motivated, that tax rise.
The fascinating thing I thought about that was how much the Treasury costed that measure as bringing in, because we'd seen before that one of the cases that the Treasury and Jeremy Hunt were making against that change was that because it would frighten people away, actually it would damage the economy and wouldn't be a significant revenue raiser. And yet they penciled in a really quite hefty £3.5 billion in a couple of years' time from the non-DOMS tax. It obviously helped Jeremy Hunt make his numbers add up. He also did more on the energy profits levy, extended that, which again was Labour policy. There, Rachel Reeves is saying, well, we'll comb through that and try and clamp down on quite a lot of the loopholes there. I mean, I think one of the things is it's actually quite difficult to pick off the taxes. I mean, Rachel Reeves can go through minor taxes. You know, you can add a bit to insurance premium tax. Everybody's saying how much insurance premiums are already going up. You can do more on air passenger duty. Interesting that Jeremy Hunt decided to go for business class fares. You can, potentially tax, big cars, vehicle exit. I mean, they're all those things, but those are very much in the minor taxes. The problem is your big taxes are the big three. They're income tax. They are where the Chancellor's already basically making lots of money through fiscal drag, even if he didn't like Amal Rajan dubbing him the fiscal drag queen on the Today programme. National insurance, which is going down, and VAT. I don't know whether Rachel Reeves is going to look at VAT or whatever beyond private schools, which is so far the one policy that Labour has put forward that the Conservatives have yet to adopt.
Yes, I mean, I think if
the next fiscal event before the election,
if you actually wanted to make to raise meaningful tax revenue, the sorts of things that Reeves has talked about, or as Jill says, you could realistically do, just aren't going to do it. You need to do something like the integration of income tax and capital gains tax, the Nigel Lawson plan, which I think a lot of us would think is in some ways very sensible. Major reform of council tax and stamp duty, or indeed the integration of income tax and national insurance, but not in such a way as to reduce national insurance, but rather to effectively ensure that the rates of national insurance that are currently applied to earned income also applied to unearned income, and in particular to pensioners. So you could, if you're prepared to integrate income tax and national insurance and put the new income tax rate up to the current something that adds the two together, then you can bring in significant amounts of revenue. If you're prepared to apply income tax to capital gains, you can bring in significant amounts of revenue. But those are very large, major structural reforms, which would require quite a lot of work, both quite a lot of detailed technical work and also, probably even more importantly, a huge amount of political courage.
I mean, the other thing Rachel Reeves has said she'll do is go through all the tax reliefs with a fine-tooth comb. But the trouble is, unless you get into some of the big structural reliefs, like things on pension contributions, the tax-free lump sum, some of those sorts of big things, or indeed the VAT reliefs, you're not talking huge amounts of money. You've got some useful bits you might clamp down on. But one of the things that the government found when it tried to follow some of the recommendations of the Office for Tax Simplification on reliefs is that even if there are very few beneficiaries, one of the problems with tax reliefs, because they're very well targeted on a few people, that they scream very, very loudly. Maybe that Rachel Reeves will have less of a problem with her backbenchers than a Conservative Chancellor might if she were there. But you start having to look at some really big things like, maybe just allowing pensions tax relief at the basic rate or something like that. There's some quite interesting revenue raises you potentially could go into.
And so if I could just come in, I think we are very likely to see all the stealth taxes maxed out if Labour do come in, for obvious reasons, given that they've sort of bound their own hands on the big revenue raisers like VAT and income tax and national insurance. But I also slightly wonder whether they might look at this idea of not paying so much to the Treasury, to the Bank of England for the QE proceeds. And I won't go into the technical details, but it basically means a tax on the banks. And it does raise some quite serious amounts of money, not in the long term, but in the short term. And I wonder if, and I don't have any particular information that they are looking at this in particularly, but I do wonder whether that might come to the surface of some of their suggestions when they do get in and are scrabbling around for money.
We'll come back to that scrabbling around because there's a couple of questions about it. But Sarah, did you want to add anything?
No, just to say that I think part of the issue here is that the public debate, I think because we're in the run-up to election, is very focused on delivering headline-grabbing tax cuts. And that means that the other side of the balance sheet, and particularly how you might push an economy into faster growth and raise tax receipts that way, receives very, very little attention. And I think the problem is the more you go after the tax cuts, the less we seem to talk and think about serious longer term plans for delivering growth.
I think that possibly speaks to your point about politics as well, because people don't vote for growth, do they? In that kind of way. But one question that sort of I've been asking myself since the budget is the fiscal rule become something of a joke? I mean, a joke partly in the sense that, debt can be going up as long as it's going down in the last year, which is slightly odd, but also just, the projections these things are based on. I don't know if you've seen that chart, that slightly passive aggressive chart the OBR put out about forecasts about fuel duty and the reality after the last few budgets. I mean, why does anyone take these things seriously anymore? And are they a useful tool of fiscal policy anymore? Was that just too jaundiced and bitter?
I mean, I don't think anyone thinks that the way it's working now is sensible or desirable for the reasons you say. It has encouraged gaming the rules in a way which is bad for policy and bad for the public debate about fiscal policy. I think this is quite regrettable. I mean, there is a genuine fiscal constraint. I mean, it's not true that we don't have any money left or whatever, but it is true that the UK the UK has significant medium to long term structural fiscal challenges. We want to spend considerably more than we are getting in tax, and you can't do that over a longer period of time. So you do need some form of fiscal constraint. It's very unfortunate the way the current fiscal rule is working is not conducive to that. I thought that the IFG report a couple of weeks ago had some useful suggestions on that. Whether they'd solve the problem, I'm not sure, but I think giving more discretion and flexibility to the OBR to actually make a judgment about whether the plans are fiscally sustainable over the medium to long term, as opposed to asking them to say, is there, does this number add up precisely after 5 years on some vague, totally implausible projections? I think that would be a rather better way of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, fiscally sustainable, but also presumably politically credible for some of them, because there's just some stuff in there that politically you don't think is deliverable, surely.
Well, I think that's essentially, I mean, the OBR already at the behest of the Treasury Select Committee sort of, adds these caveats about fuel duty, given the revealed preference of successive governments is not to raise it. And there's quite an interesting chat on the George Osborne, Ed Balls podcast about who was to blame for that, with George Osborne blaming Ed Balls, which is quite fun. I'm totally addicted to the podcast, although it makes me appalled about the state of fiscal policy in the UK, of having two political chancellors talking about it, because it just shows why we're in such a mess, in my view. But I do think if the OBR could, apply a bit more discretion about that, because the real problem is we set these fiscal rules and then the Treasury is absolutely determined to meet the letter of the rule, but absolutely not the spirit of the rule. And that's really where we're going wrong, I think, because, this sort of, it got the Chief Secretary, Laura Trott, I mean, who I think didn't really believe the government's own fiscal rules, in an interview with Evan Davis on PM, got herself tied in knots when he was saying, well, debt's going up. Debt's going to be a lot higher in 5 years' time than it is now. To which the real answer was, well, yes, but our fiscal rule only requires it then to be turning down. And actually, you look at the OBR numbers, and the turning down is so marginal between years 4 and 5 that it takes, virtually nothing to reverse the position then. So I think we need to have a bit more spirit of the fiscal rules and a bit less letter of the fiscal rules there. And I think giving some things, I think Tim Loynig in The Economist suggested that the OBR should write the first sort of paragraph of the Chancellor's budget statement about their assessment of the government's performance versus the fiscal rules, and that might act as a discipline against chancellors running so close to the wire in a sort of rather useless fashion.
Just to echo what Jonathan and Jill have said there, obviously we should be looking at the spirit of the rules rather than the letter of the rules. But I do wonder if Rachel Reeves and Labour get in, that the letter of the rules will change, because there's two measures of the public sector net debt at the moment. There's one including the Bank of England and one excluding the Bank of England. And if you look at those two charts, if you were to use including the Bank of England's balance sheet in that, then you get a much more declining profile over the next 5 years. And it wouldn't be surprising, I think, if Labour said, well, that's a way of meeting our fiscal rules by changing the letter of it, making it easier to do that than the government's current one. So watch this space on that. Although it wouldn't be, as we've been saying, meeting the spirit of the rules any more than what Jeremy Hunt has been doing.
So Ben, just for interest, is there an economic rationale for excluding the Bank of England operations? Because presumably the government, having chosen the measure that excludes it and actually having a sort of less favourable debt profile, is because they think that actually is a better signal of fiscal intent, until they discovered how difficult it was to meet that.
Yeah, well, my sense is that it definitely should be excluded, because you get a lot of distorting impacts of whenever the Bank of England does anything big on asset purchases, or all these quantitative easing effects washing through the system. So you should definitely take that out. But, when politicians, they have an eye for meeting the letter rather than the spirit, as we've seen, and this makes it easier to meet the letter, sorry.
Sarah, did you want to come in on this? Brilliant.
But I do think, Anand, though, then the ultimate test is whether you can get as your credibility, not, because as we saw, when you do things that are deemed to be, incredible in the markets, then you get your backwash. So that if you were changing it, as Ben suggested, then I think you'd need to say, actually, how do you build up your rationale? And would that convince, not just the OBR, because the OBR is a creature of government, has to just judge the government against the fiscal rules the government itself sets under its current charter. I think the question is, could you actually persuade external actors who need to buy lots of UK government debt that it's all actually okay and you're a responsible government?
I mean, I think the answer to that is, and we have, that if the OBR does actually have credibility. So if you gave the OBR a mandate to, as you said before, Jill, judge the spirit rather than the letter, and then I think the markets would actually have a reasonable degree of trust in that. As I keep on saying, the reason for the trust debacle was not so much that the government decided to loosen fiscal policy, even by quite a bit, but that it did it simultaneously with trashing those institutions of the British state that actually had a continuing degree of economic credibility. That is to say, the official Treasury, the OBR, and the Bank of England, all at once. So if you actually decided that you were going to entrench and strengthen the credible fiscal institutions of the British state, I think actually you could get away with a fiscal policy that, at least in the short term, was somewhat looser if those institutions were sort of backing it up and saying that actually medium to long term, this is broadly a credible strategy.
Which I think brings us to a future Labour government. There have been a lot of questions on Slido along the lines of what wiggle room would a Labour government have? Are they really as constrained as they're saying they are? Perhaps we can add another one to that, which is, do you really believe they're going to be as cautious in government as they say they're going to be in opposition? I mean, any or all of those, any or all of you, basically, your thoughts on this? I mean, it does, I mean, in a way, with a government whose reputation for economic management is as bad as this one, it's strange to see Labour being quite so slavish in adherence to government spending plans at the moment. You sort of think if there was ever a moment that Labour could be a little bit brave, it would be now. But again, maybe that's me being a bit unfair. But what are your thoughts on Labour and the position they inherit, and whether they're going to be as constrained as a lot of people seem to think they are, as much as they think they are going to be? Sarah, do you want to go first because you went last time, or is this a bad one for you to go?
No, that's fine. So I think, for whatever reason, and a political scientist might know more than me on this, Labour are incredibly concerned to look responsible in the eyes of voters vis-a-vis the economy, and particularly seem to not want to be portrayed in any way as a party of tax rises. That being said, I think whoever wins the election is faced with a pretty unenviable balance sheet on the UK economy. We have an ageing population, a declining or at least stagnant productivity situation. And as Jonathan said, we want and probably need to spend more on public services than we're currently bringing in tax. So I think there are two things that you could think about if you're an incoming government faced with that. One is there anything you can do to raise taxes in the sort of most politically palatable way possible? So far, the only one that's been mooted significantly, and as Jill said, not adopted by the Conservatives, is VAT on private school fees, which I think I overheard Rachel Reeves describe as sort of almost like an emergency injection of cash, a sort of quick fix to get some additional money in quite quickly. I do think that's doing a lot of heavy lifting, though, for the amount of money that it's likely to bring in. I think Ben's right that stealth taxes will be examined very closely, plus any rejigging of the rules to try and give themselves a bit more headroom. I think maybe where you might see more of a change if Labour win the election is on the other side, if you like, in terms of they might have more wriggle room to do some policy changes to help with growth, productivity and investment. Because I think here their room for manoeuvre is slightly bigger and possibly bigger than they're saying publicly. So, for example, thinking about, other things that could be done to better support UK trade, other things that could be done around planning, what's their position on migration. These are all areas where I think you might see more of a change. So if I think about the election and a possible change in government vis-a-vis this event, I think on tax, there's more similarities now, clearly, between what Conservative and Labour are proposing. I think on the other side, that's where I'd be looking to see what might change.
Okay, I mean, just before I come to the rest of it, Sarah said Labour want to look responsible, but it increasingly seems to me we've sort of entered a kind of Orwellian world that looking responsible means saying things that are fundamentally irresponsible about the state of the public finances. Jonathan, I'm sure you have views.
Yeah, I know. I agree entirely on that. I mean, I think, Sarah's clearly right on what Labour judge now. What they'll do after, what they would do after the election if they won, I don't know. What I would say though is that I think the markets will be, if I were them, I would not be unduly worried that the markets will panic if you decide to announce an emergency injection of cash into public services and especially into public investment. I think if combined with a sort of credible medium to long-term fiscal plan that the OBR is signed up on, I think actually the markets will shrug their shoulders. Well, of course, that's what a Labour government would do, and actually these people seem vaguely competent and at least serious, and that's fine. I don't think that there'd be some sort. You would not see an equivalent of the trust meltdown, and given that the markets would accept it, I don't see why one should be particularly worried about the public accepting it either. So I think they have considerably more latitude than they are maintaining publicly at the moment. But what they actually do is well, anyone's guess, but certainly not mine.
Jill or Ben, anything to add?
I mean, I think Rachel Reeves at the weekend was suggesting, I think, more capital, which I think is a very obvious place to go, which I think, as Jonathan says, wouldn't sort of particularly frighten the horses, particularly if you can tie it to productivity improvements. One of the interesting things about the OBR, I think, is its increasing willingness to be more transparent about the supply side benefits of measures, which obviously means if you do things where you can point to some sort of growth dividend within a feasible period, then you can take a bit of credit there. So I think that potentially also helps. So I would have thought that Rachel Reeves would be very keen. I mean, Labour's number one mission is the building growth mission. So I think she's got to have some ideas there. And we haven't really seen anything very concrete about that. But I think, obviously there is a folk memory of 1992 and the way in which the Conservatives weaponised Labour's tax policy there and John Smith's sort of responsible shadow budget. So I think that's why they're playing it so nervously this side of the election. But I don't think, whatever. It's very interesting that basically you have a government who is ranking at sort of 20% in the opinion polls, and your policy is to be as like them as possible, which seems a very interesting political strategy. But Anand, you're the political scientist, so you might want to comment on that.
I mean, just one thing. I mean, I was very, very young in 1992, obviously, but I mean, it does seem to me that one major difference between then and now is just how widely accepted it is that our public services are in a truly parlous state. And one of my frustrations, I mean, it's very easy to sit on the sidelines and judge politicians, obviously, but if ever there were a moment where you could have a semi-honest conversation about the fact that you might need higher taxation to fund public services that are quite obviously falling apart at the seams, would be now. And it is it is frustrating. I mean, even as a political scientist, and as a political scientist, sort of political science 101 is expect cynicism, expect, political game playing. Even given that, I find it surprising that Labour can't find a tiny bit of space to at least start that debate now, because you sort of think, if not now, then when? But again, I'll keep going with the questions unless anyone wants to tell me that
I'll just come in, Anand, just briefly on what Labour are likely to do. Look, I mean, I think the reality is that they have boxed themselves in quite substantially. They may be able to get some wiggle room by doing what I suggested on the debt and various other things, but it's tough for them. And just looking at thinking what they will actually do if they do win a majority, then look, there are a lot of people around the team who were around the team in 1997. And if you look what happened after that, they did stick very rigorously to the Conservative spending plans in a way that a lot of people didn't think they would. So you might read from that this is a replay and we're going to see the same thing. On the other hand, as you say, the circumstances in terms of public services, the idea that Labour can, impose those cuts any more than the Conservatives are is just for the birds. And the economic situation is very drastically different from 1997. There is a massive consensus that we need a new growth model, and we do need to do big things. So you can equally make a case that actually, whether we're up for this or not, they are going to have to be quite radical to get the engine of the UK economy growing again. So it's very, very difficult to see. You can look, and as I say, you can analyze both those scenarios and find some plausibility in them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, on growth scenarios, there's a question here. I mean, specifically for you, Jonathan, but if anyone else wants to chime in, from John Mann saying OBR forecasts are based on the assumption of higher legal migration. To what extent is this partly a trap for Labour governments? But would you like to speak about the link between immigration and growth more generally?
So the OBR did quite a lot of analysis on on migration in this report, particularly I think to address the reasonable criticism that people have said, well, the OBR and hence the Treasury just assume more people means more GDP, more growth, more tax revenues, but they just ignore the fact that it also means more public spending. And now that is the Treasury's fault, not the OBR's fault. That is to say, the Treasury is quite happy to take the extra tax revenue that results from more people and then to use that as a way of surreptitiously cutting public spending in per person terms by not increasing the public spending totals to match. So the Treasury, it's not that there isn't this real effect, as the Treasury uses this as a way of cutting public spending effectively. But the OBR commendably did some work where it sort of looks, well, what happens if you did actually increase public spending per person, and so that it stayed constant in per person levels. And they find that even then, migration is still quite a significant net fiscal benefit. It's basically paying for the vast majority of the tax cuts in the budget, actually, or even of the national insurance cut. Is this a trap for Labour? I don't think so, actually, because, of course, the government has got itself into a terrible mess on this. But the OBR has made its migration assumption based on what the ONS are forecasting. That forecast, of course, will be wrong because all migration forecasts, even more than economic forecasts, are hopelessly wrong. I don't think it is actually a deliberate trap. It's the OBR and the ONS taking these decisions. What it does mean, though, is that if migration, whether because of government policies or other factors, does fall significantly below the current ONS view, then that will leave that's just another further fiscal hole that one way or another Labour will have to fill through increasing tax or even lower public spending, and neither of those is terribly attractive. So it's a significant fiscal risk, certainly.
And do look out on our website. We've got a blog coming out soon about another migration-related trap that really looks like a trap for Labour around asylum seekers, which is quite interesting and quite disturbing. Anyone else on migration and growth, immigration and growth?
I mean, I would say there's another sort of unexploded bomb in the budget, which is sorry to be self-interested here, but higher education, which is the fact that already there are a number of universities facing very significant financial pressures resulting from the freezing of tuition fees, and combined with a downturn in the number of international students, it's partly driven by new government restrictions on migration. How do you solve that? Well, you either have to relax migration controls on foreign students, put up tuition fees, pump in more government money into universities, or some combination of all three of those. And all three of those, of course, have their political difficulties.
Or let some universities go under. But that too has political difficulties when we, because frankly, actually, it's not King's that's going to go under. It's universities typically in more deprived areas, serving more local students. Christ, you probably jinxed it now. Anyone else on the migration issue? I'd love it if someone wants to say that Portes is talking rubbish, but no one's going to, are they? Okay. Jill, this is one for you first and foremost, and then we'll see if anyone else wants to come in. From Anonymous, our old mate. What does this budget mean for continued fiscal divergence among the nations and the implications of that for divergent tax regimes, social policy and secession? Small question.
Okay, well, I think Humza Yusuf's about to give a talk at LSE, which can't get to because we're doing this panel at 2:30 to talk about all the problems caused for the Scottish economy by Brexit. I mean, I just noticed this was the most popular question, and I thought, well, maybe we should give it a go. And noticed that my fellow panelists, none of them were rising to it, so I'm going to throw it back at them. I think
filling all the secrets of the chat.
I think this is really interesting because I think this is really under-discussed, the extent to which we do now have divergent tax regimes. I thought one of the really interesting factors that seem to be playing into Jeremy Hunt's preference for national insurance over income tax changes was because income tax rates, not structures, but rate, not allowances, were devolved. That actually income tax was no longer perceived as a sort of national tax where the government in London owned the story about that. And that was one reason why he preferred to concentrate on national insurance, apart from this sort of double taxation awakening that he seems to have gone through in the past week about the fact you pay 2 taxes on earned income and only 1 on unearned income. So I thought that was really interesting. Scotland now has quite a sort of different thing. I mean, Scotland would say if you're lower paid in Scotland, you pay less tax. If you're higher paid, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting for tax economists out there to study how much this is. If you're higher paid, then you pay a higher rate of tax at the top end. You know, is that leading people to leave Scotland? Is Scotland suffering any sort of tax flight? I think it's really, really interesting sets of questions. And there are now quite fascinating, complex interactions between decisions made in the UK budget and the implications for all those devolves. We've also seen, and I think slightly under highlighted as well, as some of the increasingly divergent public service performance across the 4 nations, because we tend to get news concentration on where we are. I mean, one of the things that's been highlighted quite often, some people have said, why hasn't the Conservative government made more of a song and dance about it, is the very divergent performance of English schools on at least the sort of PISA measures compared with schools in Scotland and Wales. And you could say that those governments have been more, if you like, producer sympathetic than the ones in England. So I think it's a really interesting and understudied thing. So I thought this was an interesting question to which I can only give partial answers, but I do think people are beginning to wake up to some of the constraints that devolution is imposing on tax regimes. And of course, there are some underlying differences. One of the big debates before the DUP went back into power sharing was would Chris Heaton-Harris finally impose water charges in Northern Ireland? Northern Ireland still doesn't pay for its water in the way in which we do in the rest of the UK. And that's one reason why their government's slightly underfunded. So I think there's some really interesting underexplored questions, which is why this is a fairly hopeless answer. Sorry, Anonymous.
That was a sterling effort, actually, Jill, and I'm going to forgive you for mentioning a competitor podcast and the LSE in the same event. Anyone else want to chip in?
I actually have a couple of things. So one on the different income tax situation in Scotland and England. When we've done research with financial firms about their location preferences post-Brexit, I know this doesn't sound immediately relevant, but it is, they actually drew attention to the fact that managing 2 different regimes was potentially adding cost to their business and was making, certainly some went on record saying that it was making Scotland a less attractive business environment for them in financial services, which obviously matters particularly for Edinburgh and Glasgow. So I think, as Jill said, there are some interesting implications there that we don't have that much research on, but some of the initial work is quite interesting. And I then think there's a whole set of really interesting questions about regional differentiation in tax and also actually in spend across the UK. So when I hear that question, I can't really not think about the bankruptcies of local authorities and the implications of that for council tax rises in particular places, which are also seeing really, really swingeing cuts to their public services. And here, the UK is quite unusual compared to a lot of other advanced economies in having a sort of centralised and nationalised tax regime, but also controlling the purse strings largely from Whitehall. And certainly if you speak to devolved administrations, one of their complaints is that they don't have sufficient control of their budgets to meet local needs. And there's actually some really super interesting debates emerging that are sort of taking this beyond the realms of tax to even things like, should people be paying different energy bill rates in different places depending on, how close they are to energy production. So I think this question of the sort of geographical scale, if you like, at which you tax and spend is really interesting.
I think the government's just come out today with its ideas for energy market reform, which I think, and Ben can probably explain this much better than I can, the government is interested in exploring zonal pricing, but not nodal pricing, which seems to mean that where you live might determine what your energy bill is rather than what the source of your energy is. So, which I think they say produce too complicated a system. It's quite interesting, and I'm going to annoy Anand further. At the launch of the Institute for Government Centre Commission.
Oh, good Lord.
Sorry about that. There was sort of all these people going on about we need to devolve more, we need strengthen devolution, that's the way forward, UK over centralised. And then people just say quite flippantly, and we need to sort out local government finance. And you want to think, well, fine, yes, I've worked on local government finance a long time ago. It's not that easy just to flip a switch and sort out local government finance. That is massively complicated when you have really different taxable capacity across the regions of England, across the UK. It really is quite a difficult thing to do in a fair way.
And it's probably worth noting that Wales has grasped the nettle of council tax revaluation, something that we haven't done in England and has been put off continually for decades now. So that's an example of where the national regional differences in terms of going their own way might be a progressive thing if it's perceived to be result in a fairer system, a more efficient system, as well as the Scottish income tax divergence as well.
And Scotland led the way on stamp duty reform from the slab to the slice system. The Scots did it first, and then George Osborne sort of counterbid them with a UK reform, and I think they then had to amend their reform because the context had changed, but because stamp duty is one of the devolved taxes.
Yep, reban council tax, give the money to local government, I say. But actually, my takeaway from that event yesterday, Jill, was Louise Casey pointing out that Yorkshire is significantly bigger than Wales and therefore should get loads more money. Well, the last bit I made up, but she definitely said that Yorkshire's a load bigger than Wales. Now, there's a couple of things. There's one question I want to ask you very, very quickly, just from watching the budget. A lot has been made of what I took to be a bit of a throwaway remark from Jeremy Hunt about we'd like to abolish national insurance. When I heard it, I thought he meant it in the same way as I mean it when I say I should eat more healthily, which is sort of, in passing, no one takes me seriously. Labour have made a big deal of that, which is perhaps unsurprising. But do you think that was more than a throwaway line? Did that strike you as a serious policy ambition or just a bit of red meat on the day? I mean, it's impossible to say, but I'd just be interested in your thoughts if you have any. Is there a political agenda behind this?
Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts is that any serious proposal to do away with national insurance would talk about what it's going to be replaced with, because it obviously raises, considerable amounts of money, 150 billion pounds, I think, roughly. And obviously, you'd have to specify which type of national insurance you're talking about. I mean, obviously, he was talking about it in the context of employee national insurance, but half is raised by employer national insurance, of course. And in terms of the economic effects, the impact is the same. It's a tax on jobs, as the Conservatives often used to remind us. So if you're doing it because you want to encourage people into work, then logically you should be getting rid of the employer national insurance element as well as the employee one. I find it quite hard to regard it as anything more than a narrative for them to cling on to. They've made the decision in the autumn statement and the budget to reduce it quite substantially, and they want to say, well, if you extrapolate that out, it might go all together. But yes, I mean, bottom line is you'd need to see a serious plan about how to replace it. And as Jonathan was talking about before, folding it into income tax would And other think tanks would say this is a very good thing because it's not hypothecated in any way, and it's very confusing the fact that we have this as a separate pot, as a separate raising device from income tax. So that would be a thumbs up. But it's a complicated thing, and you'd have to deal with it in the round, and it's not something you just chuck out as an aspiration and expect to be taken seriously, I would argue.
I mean, you would also have to decide whether you were seriously up for imposing a much bigger tax charge on people of pension age, which would be the implication of doing that. I mean, you could compensate by reintroducing the age allowance that George Osborne is sort of grandfathering out of the system, and do something there if you were really having a serious reform proposal. I mean, it seemed to sort of, I think they got a bit carried away, basically. And I think some of the junior ministers looking for things to do it, which, rather moved the focus on from having had quite a big tax cut to what comes next. And is this going in that direction? I mean, the odd thing is the really big unfunded thing in the government's plans is not this sort of aspiration, is their NHS workforce plan, which comes in with a massive price tag, I think, and isn't anywhere in the numbers that I can see at the moment.
No, absolutely. I mean, that significantly expanded workforce is probably going to expect to be paid at some point, and the numbers aren't there. But anyway, everyone on Slido is probably thinking, I'm not going to ask this question because I've ignored it for so long, but it is the sort of ghost at the feast, which is Brexit. Brexit, of course, figures in all the OBR reports, is never ever mentioned by the Chancellor in his speech, and is something that Labour aren't talking about either. So firstly, I mean, if you want to reflect on that weird situation, that's interesting. But also, do we think Labour will be able to keep the same trick going as easily as the Conservatives in power? Or are Labour going to have to really start thinking about and talking about the economic impacts of Brexit? And I suspect it'll be harder in power than it is for them in opposition to do what they're doing. But I don't know if you have thoughts. I realise it's quite a political as opposed to an economic question, but...
Well, got to let me come in and
absolutely,
and plug our very excellent UK and Changing Europe report out tomorrow.
There we go.
On a, you weren't teeing me up for that at all, were you, Anand? End experience for people who haven't switched off yet. So Brexit in the state, which I wanted to call done yet ? And you thought that was too political, because its big message, of course, is that Brexit remains still a work in progress, and the government is frankly not really had a strategic grasp of what it wanted to do with Brexit and with its new Brexit freedoms and powers. I think it's a really interesting question about whether Labour can do anything that moves the dial to reduce some of the economic impacts of Brexit that the OBR highlight, reduce trade frictions. I think the conclusion generally is actually within their self-imposed constraints of not joining the customs union, not joining the single market, it's quite difficult to see anything that would get the OBR to significantly revise that 4% figure in a different direction, which is what you might want to do. But the world may change. I think there's a very good article by you in the FT talking about the need for a broader strategic vision, and maybe for the EU to stop getting stuck like a mouse on the Barnier staircase of fond memories, which said you can only have a relationship like ones we've already had with other countries, which are totally unlike the UK. So we'll see what happens after our election, and crucially also after the European Parliament elections, and possibly even more crucially after the US election on that. But I think one of the interesting things to emerge from our report, I would say, is Jeremy Hunt made a lot about public sector productivity, and it's very difficult to go through our report without taking the view it may just be at the margin, but everywhere you turn, the way we've done Brexit so far has made the UK state a bit less efficient, a bit less productive. We're having to take on all these new functions. We haven't yet found a way of doing them in a radically, cash releasing, staff releasing way. So we've had to add in lots and lots of people to do things, add lots of costs along the way. And as yet, we haven't really had a big project to see much on the positive side of the balance sheet from that. So if you want to look at sort of drags on public sector productivity, I think Brexit's definitely been one of them.
I'd just add, Anand, that I think when you look at the sort of recent history or recent economic history of the UK, when the economy struggles, the question of Europe gets louder, and that's whether it gets louder to join or leave, depending on which part of history you look at. And I think, as we come out of an election and, you know, the economy, you know, if it delivers the growth that the OBR is suggesting, it's still quite low. It's really hard for me to see how the question of Europe will disappear in that context, particularly given the way in which the OBR sort of stresses the trade drag on the UK from Brexit. It's remaining with its kind of original estimates around 15% on trade intensity, I think.
And the productivity impact.
Exactly. And then you see that in the micro level in the budget. So there's quite a lot, there's a debate yesterday in Parliament, and there's quite a lot of detail in the budget about tax breaks for the creative industries. But at the same time, you've got, you know, the creative industries receiving less funding from the EU. So that it's not that you can sort of carve out Europe as a special part of economic policy. It's like when you're right next door to Europe, it remains a key feature of the UK economy, whether you're in or outside the EU.
I think it's also the case in a Labour government that you'll have far more backbenchers willing to carp about this than you have, obviously, in the current Conservative Party. So I wonder whether, you know, when Rachel Reeves gives her budgets, if she ends up giving budgets, there will be people like Stella Creasy saying, but hang on, you haven't mentioned the 4% that the OBR are bagging. And I think that would be a very different political context, I would have thought.
Yeah,
Yeah,
look, I think it's quite hard to imagine a Labour government coming in and starting saying, right, we're going to rejoin the single market or the customs union.
Absolutely.
That's not going to happen. That said, I think their thinking on Brexit, the whole Brexit issue has been very much coloured by 2019 and the sort of sense of repudiation of what they'd been doing in advance of that election. Once we get past the vote, if Labour have a largish majority, as I say, I don't think they'll start trying to rejoin, but it may make them much more inclined to talk about it, to talk about ways of making the current deal run more smoothly, all the things that UK and Changing Europe have been talking about. I think the atmosphere in the party, in the government, as it would be then, around this issue will probably change quite a lot, and they may lose quite a lot of their caution around it.
Jonathan.
I agree with Ben. I think it's very difficult to predict. The political environment will be quite different. There will be more pressure, and we haven't really talked about the international environment at all, but there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and in particular, the election of Trump and/or conflict with China over Taiwan would completely upset the international economy in a way that, you know, I'm confident in saying would be of huge significance, both economically and politically, to the UK, but completely unconfident of saying of how it would affect the UK economy and politically. I think any sort of predictions that say with certainty, oh, you know, nothing significant is going to happen on this front for the next 2 years. I think that we certainly cannot be confident. I think there will be significant shocks, and which may mean that things move quite a lot faster than you might think, given the sort of frozen state of the current Brexit debate in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about a debate about the fact NATO might not have a future that makes SPS sound rather parochial in the greater scheme of things. Absolutely. So just as a final question, as a nice way to round it off, do we get too excited by budgets? That's to say, do we give them far more coverage than they actually deserve? I mean, Jill is obviously going to have thoughts on the coverage of the budget before the budget happens, particularly the Chancellor's interviews on the Sunday before. But do we give them disproportionate time and bandwidth, do you think?
Well, I'm a bit conflicted about this, Anand, because it's a very big day in my working life, and it's a time when, you know, everyone wants to know what the views of the economics editor are and about the economy, and it's got great stuff that you can get in there that you can't usually talk about, like productivity, etc. But then again, I do think, as I mentioned right at the start, you know, if the economic circumstances haven't drastically changed, the idea that you were having these fiscal events, you know, they do feel a bit redundant in that sense. And as you guys and many other think tanks have pointed out, there are occasions for politicized tinkering with the economy, which the record of the economy suggests that all that tinkering is doing much more harm than it is good. So professionally, I'm all in favor of having a lot of budgets and fiscal events. When I look at it from an economics eye, I think we need a lot fewer of them.
We feel your pain, Ben.
I'm a sort of budget addict as a result of working in the Treasury. I mean, budgets are sort of super good fun. But actually, if you look at the difference that the budget makes to people's sort of day-to-day lives, they're hugely less significant than loads of other announcements and things that government does. And we don't clear the front page of the FT, don't have special supplements, don't change the TV schedules and stuff like that for them. So I think we pay them far too much attention. That means that things like just indexing things sort of becomes sort of big event, or non-indexation, which shouldn't. So I think we do pay them far too much attention. Ben is absolutely right. We should only have one fiscal event a year. And I sometimes wonder whether Jeremy Hunt might think that too, because actually, I think he didn't get that much bounce from what he did in November. Maybe if he'd actually rolled November and March together, he'd have had more flexibility and might have made a bit of a bigger impact. So I think we shouldn't do them. I also think we should do them differently. Now the Treasury has basically blown the gaff completely on budget secrecy, make them much more subject to normal policy making.
Jonathan or Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I agree with all of that. I mean, I also think, some of this stuff you could do better if you didn't have the budget. So to take the tax and income tax and national insurance, there are some really big, important issues here. Would be quite sensible to have a proper discussion and debate about, should you integrate tax and national insurance? What does that look like? What are the economic and distributional consequences of that? To do that, though, you need a review, consultation, you need to engage external experts, tax lawyers, economists, and so on in a process. Instead, of course, what we get is this scraping around the fiscal forecast to find the money for a headline cut, and then throw away remarks about, it would be nice if we didn't have to pay national insurance at all. That's not a way to make policy.
Well, excellent. On that note, we will see you after the next big fiscal event that we'll make a huge amount of, just so you tune into this. But on a more serious note, thank you to all four of you. That was really, really interesting as ever, and has made a load of things I basically haven't understood over the last week a hell of a lot clearer. I hope it has for all of you watching. Do tune in to future lunch hours. We've got loads of them. I can't remember what they're about or when they are, but you can go to our website. And as Jill said, look out for her wonderful new report, which will be hitting your bookshelves, well, your internet, tomorrow morning. So look out for that too. Thanks, everyone, and see you soon. All the best.